In May 2005, Wall Street delivered a gut punch to Detroit. The companies that built America were suddenly labeled junk. General Motors and Ford Motor Company were no small-town outfits. These were the kings of chrome, horsepower, and backyard pride. Then came the headlines that rattled the Motor City. GM cut to junk, they read, like a sheriff pinning a bad notice to the saloon door. For the first time in modern history, America's auto giants were officially risky. That word junk hit harder than a Michigan winter. Investors weren't laughing, and neither were retirees. Billions of dollars in bonds suddenly looked like yesterday's leftovers. The question wasn't just what happened. It was how did Detroit's titans fall this far? To understand the fall, we have to rewind the tape. Back when GM and Ford ruled the American highway. After World War II, the Big Three owned the road. If it rolled, rumbled, or roared, it probably came from Detroit. By the 1990s, profits were riding high on SUVs and trucks. Gas was cheap, and bigger felt better. But beneath the chrome shine, trouble was brewing. The cost of promises made decades earlier was coming due. Healthcare and pension costs were stacking up fast. Retirees outnumbered active workers by the tens of thousands. Deals struck with the United Auto Workers decades before were ironclad. Good for workers, heavy for balance sheets. Meanwhile, foreign competition was moving in quietly. Toyota and Honda were building leaner, cheaper cars. American buyers were noticing the difference. Reliability was becoming the new horsepower. Sales slipped, but factories kept running. Overcapacity became Detroit's silent enemy. At the helm of General Motors stood Rick Wagoner, calm, measured, and facing a storm bigger than Texas. At Ford, Bill Ford Jr. carried a legendary name. Saving the family company was not in the brochure. Both men inherited massive companies and massive obligations. The road ahead was anything but smooth. By early 2005, losses were stacking higher than chrome bumpers in a Texas junkyard. Investors started asking hard questions nobody wanted to answer. GM reported billions in losses tied to healthcare and falling sales. The balance sheet looked heavier than a fully loaded Suburban. Healthcare costs alone were nearing $5 billion a year. That's a lot of aspirin for one company. Ford wasn't exactly cruising either. Sales were slipping and profit margins were thinning fast. Pickup trucks kept the lights on, but gas prices were creeping up. Bigger engines suddenly felt a little awkward at the pump. Meanwhile, Toyota quietly climbed the rankings. Reliability reports weren't doing Detroit any favors. Wall Street analysts started circling like cautious ranch hands. They could smell trouble on the horizon. Credit rating agencies began reviewing the numbers closely. The spreadsheets told a stubborn story. Moody's analysts reached similar conclusions. Debt levels were towering and cash flow was shrinking. Behind closed doors, executives knew the stakes. A downgrade would raise borrowing costs overnight. Bond investors were watching carefully. Pension funds held massive amounts of GM and Ford debt. The stage was set for a historic decision. Detroit's fate was about to be stamped in bold letters. On May 5, 2005, Standard & Poor's cut GM to junk status. Wall Street didn't whisper. It gasped. Moody's Investors Service followed with its own downgrade. 2 agencies, one loud message. General Motors had officially become a fallen angel. It was the largest corporate downgrade in history. Ford's debt soon slid toward junk territory too. Investors started tightening their belts. Junk status means higher borrowing costs, plain and simple. It's like paying steakhouse prices for diner coffee. Some institutional investors were forced to sell immediately. Rules don't allow junk in certain portfolios. Billions in GM bonds hit the market at once. Prices dropped fast. Stock prices sank alongside bond values. Shareholders felt the ground move. Rick Wagoner faced reporters with steady composure. Calm leadership was now a full-time job. He insisted GM had liquidity and a recovery plan. Confidence was essential, even if markets doubted. Bill Ford Jr. delivered his own message of resolve. The Ford name wasn't ready for a history lesson. But markets listened to numbers more than speeches. Debt totals were towering. GM carried over $300 billion in total obligations. That's a mountain even Detroit steel couldn't lift. Pension and healthcare liabilities added heavy weight. Retirees depended on those promises. Suppliers began worrying about payment delays. Smaller companies can't absorb big tremors. Credit default swap markets lit up with activity. Traders priced in higher risk. The downgrade rippled through global credit markets. International investors held GM bonds too. Back in Detroit, uncertainty settled in quietly. Factory floors felt different. United Auto Workers leaders watched closely. Negotiations were bound to get tougher. Community leaders feared job losses ahead. Detroit had weathered storms before. Analysts debated whether bankruptcy was possible. That word carried weight. For now, both companies promised restructuring plans. Cost cuts were coming. Wall Street had delivered its verdict. Detroit had to respond fast. The downgrade wasn't the collapse. It was the warning shot. Inside corporate offices, emergency meetings filled calendars. Every expense faced scrutiny. Ford prepared a bold gamble of its own. The company would soon mortgage nearly everything. The auto crisis of 2005 was far from over. It was just shifting gears. Markets would keep watching every move. Detroit's resilience was being tested. Executives knew the path ahead required sacrifice. No easy shortcuts remained. The downgrade was the beginning of a reckoning. Detroit was entering its toughest mile. By 2006, restructuring was no longer optional. It was survival math. GM announced plant closures across North America. Thousands of jobs were on the line. Buyouts and layoffs followed quickly. Assembly lines slowed. Rick Wagoner defended the cuts as necessary. The numbers left little room for comfort. Ford prepared a bold move of its own. It would mortgage nearly everything it owned. In late 2006, Ford secured over $20 billion in loans. The Blue Oval bet the ranch. Then came a leadership shift. Alan Mulally arrived from Boeing. Mulally pushed a unified global strategy. Fewer platforms, tighter discipline. He demanded transparency in meetings. Red ink had to be shown, not hidden. Meanwhile, GM struggled to regain investor trust. Losses continued to mount. Detroit neighborhoods felt the impact first. Layoffs ripple fast. Local diners and hardware stores saw fewer customers. Paychecks were disappearing. United Auto Workers leaders entered tough negotiations. Concessions were unavoidable. Retirees worried about pensions promised decades earlier. Security felt uncertain. Washington watched with growing concern. Manufacturing mattered beyond Michigan. Credit markets tightened further in 2007. The financial system was trembling. By 2008, the broader financial crisis erupted. Auto sales collapsed. Credit dried up for buyers and automakers alike. Confidence vanished quickly. General Motors approached the brink in 2009. Bankruptcy became reality. Rick Wagoner stepped down amid government pressure. Leadership changed again. Ford narrowly avoided bankruptcy. The earlier loan bought time. Alan Muley's gamble paid off. Discipline steadied the company. Detroit endured one of its toughest chapters. Recovery would take years. The downgrade in 2005 was not the collapse. It was the warning. Wall Street had signaled the danger early. Few listened closely enough. Industrial strength alone was no longer enough. Adaptation became survival. The auto crisis reshaped corporate America. Lessons were costly. Detroit proved resilient, but scars remained. Pride carried on. The junk label was more than a rating. It was a turning point. America's industrial heart was tested and transformed. The road ahead demanded change.